Hi everyone. Thank you for joining and welcome to the session. My name is Christina Joby Maria. I'm a junior consultant at Townsend Townsend, and we are joined today by Kate Watson, principal consultant from Townsend Townsend. The purpose of the event, this is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Townsend Townsend.
Thanks, Christina, and welcome everybody. Today's masterclass is focused on getting ready to deliver a successful retrofit program and thinking about what that looks like, building those foundations for success into delivery. So hopefully a lot of this you already know, but maybe there's some new bits or different approaches or views you could take. So today we are going to have a look at how to develop a robust delivery plan, best practices for procurement and contract management, strategies for setting clear expectations and avoiding common pitfalls, fostering strong collaborative relationships with contractors, and then we'll have a summary. And as per normal, we've got all the resources on our website. So I think just kind of we need to think. I know I work with a lot of people, housing associations, local authorities who have experience of delivering major projects. And I think when sometimes it's like, what's the difference with retrofit? And I think it's a good question, but I do think there are some subtle differences. Some of the work that we do doesn't result in something nice and shiny to look at and to show off to your neighbour. So, like a new kitchen or a bathroom, and it's not always tangible. So it can be really difficult to get people on board to be part of that process. And there are also a lot of pitfalls potentially about where things can go wrong, and we do a session on that as well about considering good practice. I think that's one of the PAS ones actually. So they do differ slightly, and it's worth going through this again. So we'll talk about robust delivery plans, and I think we need to start with what is a delivery plan, and it's not the same as a project schedule. So I think that's the first point. So a delivery plan will encompass a number of different things, and it's important because it helps you set a strategic approach to your project. It helps define the net zero goals that you're going after and helps you understand whether you've met it at an evaluation stage. It helps you think about more the wider context of funding and how you can use that to best effect for the outcomes that you're looking for. And it will help you develop a supply chain management process. So there's some details here. So London is retrofitting homes 10 times slower than needed to hit net zero by 2030. And I assume that is in the social housing and low income sectors supported by local authorities rather than all housing. That could even be much further figure away. And then when we start having a look into the cost associated with it, it's 42% more expensive, and 42% exceed their initial budgets by more than 20%. There's something going wrong here, and we really need to understand what's going wrong. Is it just that, retrofit in London, like everything else in London, is significantly more expensive, or is there something else at play? And then 73% of project managers running retrofit projects cite poor data for some of the issues that they're seeing. So between the gaps between planned and actual required retrofit measures. So in this research, London's retrofit revolution, there you go. The main causes were inadequate planning, ambiguous scope definition, disconnected stakeholders, and reactive problem solving. So, it's really clear that there's some fundamentals that they have not been doing. Perhaps other people are doing those as well. And hopefully we can have a look at how you might go about doing that. So it's really useful when you're thinking about your project plan to break it down into manageable phases, and you can set some realistic deadlines for achieving certain milestones or specific deliverables for each phase. So you can have phases that might go over several years, and then you would have sections within that phase that you're looking to complete certain areas of. So you can identify those milestones and those key deliverables. You define the project scope and the objectives. and you can develop a detailed project schedule. So once you've understood the phases and what you need to achieve, for those milestones, that's when you put it into a project schedule and lay it out. And once you do that, you can start looking at all those dependencies, if there are any, and whether that's going to have an impact on your critical path, or whether it's going to sort of meet your phase delivery expectations, or whether you're going to potentially have some issues with resourcing the work that needs to be done. And that brings us nicely onto the how do you allocate resources effectively if you don't know what it is that you're delivering and how much work will take. So doing this delivery planning will really help you understand that in more detail. So we can look at a retrofit project in a phased approach, and a lot of successful retrofit projects will follow this sort of 4-phase approach. So it begins with the assessment phase. So that's a thorough assessment of the building's current performance, and it identifies opportunities where you could improve the performance of the building. We then look at the design phase, and that translates into opportunities to look at technical specifications that will help you achieve the outcomes that you're looking for. Then there's the implementation phase. That's where the work actually happens. And finally, there's this verification or handover stage. Ideally, you do the verification stage before you hand over, but they sort of go alongside each other, hand in hand. And that will enable you to manage your contract terms and your payments better if you are doing that verification. So, what do we need to think about within that structure? What is the logical sequencing of retrofit measures for that building? You don't want to install measures that could get damaged because you're doing something else afterwards. You don't want to install something like a new heating system, ideally, if there are fabric works that are planned in a year or 3 years' time, because that heating system may not be then the right size for the building in when you come back to do the fabric works. Maybe you do the fabric works first and then come back and do the heating second. You need to think about the occupancy, the people that are in that building, and how you're going to manage them during the construction phase. Also, I'd say the pre-construction and the post-construction phase, because there's a lot of visits that potentially take place. And then we really need to get these handovers better. And, to be fair to residents, by the time you get to that handover, you kind of sick to the back teeth of the contractors coming in, and really you just want people to leave you alone in peace. We need to make sure that any systems that are taken out or put in are decommissioned and commissioned as appropriate, or recommissioned if they're taken offline while other works are doing. So it's really important that we don't want to end up with something not working as we intended. So the earlier you can recommission items or commission them in the delivery phase, the better, or the implementation phase. We need to consider whether we need to provide temporary services or accommodation. So this could include, I know a lot of people, if they've done external wall installation, are worried about their satellite dishes, and how they're going to manage that. But in terms of accommodation, yes, it's looking for alternative accommodation, or perhaps somewhere people can go during the day when works are being taken place, so that it's not noisy and dusty and they don't have to put up with that. So there are different routes we can think about. It's worth us thinking about how we can mock up examples of what we're planning to do. This is really great for consultation with residents, but it can also help with ensuring that we've got the outcomes that we're wanting. So testing new equipment, making sure it works before we go into full scale implementation. Sometimes this is done through sort of pilot studies. Sometimes you can do it off-site, and you can set up other things like trying to get the heat pump to work. So it's worth considering that if you are looking at new approaches to doing retrofit. We want to try and capture lessons learned. Lessons learned are really helpful. It helps us improve how we deliver projects. It helps us identify better ways to communicate. It identifies areas where things aren't happening. And where we're doing phased approach to delivery, it's a really useful tool for capturing the learning and integrating it into the next phase. We need to think about contingency planning. So I know most people will have a contingency fund within their overarching delivery. Sort of 10% is quite a normal one that we've seen. But it's also useful to think about what are some of those unexpected things that might happen? I mean, it's very hard to think of everything, but it is kind of useful to have some ideas. I mean, who knew 5 years ago we'd all be sat indoors for the summer? And then we need to think about the residents, the people that we are engaging with, and how the work that we want to do will impact them, and how we can minimize that, keep them informed, and make sure that they come on that journey with us and make it as easy for us to deliver as possible. So, one of the things you can do with a project plan is identify roles and responsibilities. It's a very simple matrix that we've got here. I mean, they can get quite complex if there's lots of different people. But simply put, you want to identify the role and then what stage in the program that they are involved in and what their kind of primary responsibilities. Are they responsible for that role? Are they kind of affected by that role? Do they have to kind of be involved at some stage? And you can see here we've got different people in different roles. I mean, on this one we've got the contractors are not involved with the planning and design stage, but you might have contractors that are involved with the planning and design stage. It really depends on the contract terms that you have. So you really need to do this for every project if you're changing the way you're delivering in order to make sure it's relevant to the one that you are actually delivering. So some components of an effective delivery plan. Realistic timelines with critical path analysis and buffer periods. So your critical path is the one that will not sort of really budge, and so it's normally the longest timeline. So you can do multiple different aspects of a project, but there will be one aspect of that sort of project where there is no movement and you can't do anything else until you've completed that task. So that is what the critical path analysis is. And also it's worth building in buffers for that. So once upon a time, I worked in a different industry. I worked in commercial interiors. Lots of furniture comes from Italy and Spain, and they tend to shut down in August. So, one of our critical paths was making sure if we had ordered our furniture, if they were coming from Italy or Spain in time, that to get processed before people went on holiday, and it was going to be delivered in time for whenever the unit opened. You need to be clear about what your project milestones are. What are you trying to achieve within a certain stage? Why is it a milestone? Is there a reporting requirement attached to it? Is there a payment decision attached to it? There can be lots of different milestones, and you need to kind of work out what they are. And you can have stage gate decision points. So this might be a point where if you're going out to procurement, that you might need approval to appoint somebody. You might need approval to actually submit your tender documents. And so you need to build those decision gateways into your project plan or project schedule to make sure that you know when they're going to happen. Being built into the plan might be things like actually what the decision gateways are themselves, in terms of this one needs to go to this committee meeting. The committee meetings are held quarterly. The next 3 committee meetings are on these dates. So you can put those in a project plan, and you can put it in a project schedule. You need to know that you've got enough people, you've got the right resources allocated for the right jobs at the right time, and understand what that looks like in a fluctuating program, because there'll be moments when you're not busy, and then there'll be others where you may have a surge of demand. In order to deliver contracts, you'll need to think about who you're going to procure. So what are those procurement lead-in times? What's the minimum and what's the most likely, and what's the worst case scenario? And then you want to have a think about your supply chain and who you might want through. Are you going to do a supply chain analysis? Are you just going through a framework and working with whoever happens to be on that framework? And why have you chosen that framework? You'll need to think about your risk management for your project and how you're going to manage that and escalate. So your contingency and protocols come into play. What are those points that you escalate and bring other people in? And then you've got things like quality assurance and verification frameworks. So that's making sure you're meeting the expectations of the funding criteria. You're meeting building regulations. You're applying to all the other kind of regulations that come into play about asbestos, electric, gas, all of that sort of stuff. So it's really important you understand what you've got to work with, and everybody can read the plan and see what those requirements are. And then Going back to the householders, you've got a handover with them and you've got a post evaluation process. So that's sort of interviewing, surveying the residents to have their experience, but also their experience of the house as it is, with the changes and any issues that have come up. So now we're going to have a look at some best practices for procurement and contract management. So an effective procurement strategy is for retrofit projects, it often means involving contractors early to benefit from their practical experience. So what does that really mean? It doesn't mean that you have to work with those contractors throughout, but you could start engaging with them to understand what it is that they do, what their approach is, whether they have some recommendations of products or approach. But it's also a really helpful stage to start building relationships. Ideally, when you're procuring, you want to think about previous retrofit experience. There are a number of, we used to call them unintended consequences. I think we've kind of veered away from that term now. But unintended consequences, they're not unintended. They're sort of, they weren't planned in, but they often come through a lack of planning or a lack of knowledge and thinking about how different measures interact with each other. So thinking about retrofit experience and asking questions around how they've dealt with certain situations and how they've resolved things in the past can help you understand where the contractors are at on their retrofit journey and what their level of knowledge is. Historically, through the public procurement, public contract regulations, I think it's procurement contract regulations, there was often a lowest price tendering approach. It doesn't work that well with retrofit, and I would kind of encourage people to move away from that. But you might want to think about sort of a more value-based, quality-based kind of pricing structure so that you're really thinking about what it is you're trying to achieve, what the outcome is, the sort of behaviors you're looking for, the quality of the install, rather than just the lowest price to get the job done. And then you really need to have a very clear scope of what it is that you want your contractors to deliver in order to reduce variations on the project, on the buildings, or in the overall sort of delivery of the program. So there's four kind of contract structures listed here. You've got a traditional contract, and the traditional contract will give you a clear scope and a fixed price for doing a piece of work, which is obviously really great when you know what it is that you want to do, how many meters squared installs or window sizes for each and every property. Not so good if you haven't got that information. But the more information you have, the better you can get to a fixed price, knowing what it is that you want to deliver. You can have a design and build contract. These are really useful when you have less idea about the project and what it is that you want to do, and you want the contractor to take that responsibility for making sure all the work gets done. There are energy performance contracts, and this is where the outcome is a guaranteed saving, normally in kilowatt hours rather than costs, because costs will fluctuate, whereas kilowatt hours hopefully will be consistent. So you're looking to achieve a certain kilowatt hour reduction in the energy use in that building. It's not particularly well adopted in the UK, but there might be some people out there that are doing it. Energy Strong were one of those people that were looking into it. And then you've got frameworks, and I know a lot of people look on a framework to see who they can go to. If you're doing them yourself, you'll be building a longer term relationship with that contractor and trying to build that over time. So how do we think about what's good when we're procuring a contractor or selecting a contractor off a framework? So the selection criteria is really important. And here we've got an example of price at 30%. And honestly, I really wouldn't go above 30%, because I've seen so many procurements where a 40% pricing structure will skew the person that wins based on the lowest price. So anything above 30 is a bit of a challenge. You might want to have a look at things like we've got here, the experience of the contractor. I'm putting 25% on that. The methodology of the approach, how they're going to approach delivering the contract that you want them to deliver. And that could include things like lead generation. If you're looking for people to find your residents for you, that sounds wrong. If you're a local grant applicant, you don't know necessarily where your houses are that you want to retrofit. So particularly can help there. But it might be like that they're doing retrofit assessment, retrofit coordination, design, planning. They, you might have a kind of somebody that's managing the whole project for you. So it's really important that you understand what their processes are in that methodology. Or it could just be as simply as how would you go about kind of doing this installation on this type of property? And then you need to understand what their capacity is. So, how many other projects are they working on? How are they going to increase their capacity to deliver if there's a specific demand or a delay in the program? And you really want to understand that. You want to go through a pre-qualification process. So you want to understand their financial stability, their technical capacity, and previous experience. You might want to do technical interviews. So you might come down to maybe 3 or 4 that have gone through that PQQ, and then you want to do an interview with them. Or you might want to do a scenarios-based assessment where, you could come up with a proposal. How would you tackle this scenario, and ask them to provide you with a response. You need to set out a clear marking criteria if you do that, of course, that's, transparent to everybody. You need to think about what your capacity is and the contractors for innovation. If yours is low, then don't go for an innovation type route. Make it clear what you want to do. Likewise, if you've want to go down an innovative route and your contractors aren't that minded, then that's going to be a tricky relationship at some stage. But you do want somebody that is problem solving. I mean, I would say most contractors probably are problem solving, but it's the attitude that comes along with that problem solving approach. Social value is a really key part of all procurement. So you'll want to think about your social or their social value commitments and how much of that is environmental as opposed to social. And then you want to think about, and this comes back to the capacity, is the supply chain resilience and a subcontractor arrangements. What are the arrangements that they have in place with their supply chain, which enable them as your contractor to meet your needs as the client? Payment is really important to contractors. Prompt payment is a problem for a lot of people. It can go two ways. We do need some verification and proof of works that have been completed and signed off. So this is why it's really important to think about that handover sign-off process and commissioning process right at the beginning of your project. You don't want to get to site and then be going, oh, right, blimey, we've got this project finishing in a week's time and we haven't thought about how we're going to do the handover. So, this is another piece that you need to do up front. But I think, in order to keep performance on track, we need to think about how can we manage certain elements of the program to help us get the best performance from our contractors. So you might want to think about whether you link payments to particular milestones. You consider retention of payment around confirmation of quality assurance. You could think about shared savings for performance as well, or something like an early completion bonus. I would not have any early completion bonuses without a quality assurance aspect to it as well, but it can be a driver to meet those deadlines if you are sort of looking down the line and seeing something and thinking, crikey, we're not going to meet that. So, using different payment approaches is a really helpful way of managing your contract. It can help you stay on track with those milestones and delivery proposals that you're looking at. Retention payments can be helpful, particularly, if you want to pay your bills on time, but also there are some delays around how quickly information come back. I would be mindful about retention over the duration of the project, because kind of a few £1,000, a few £100 here and there on a small project might not be something that's an impact. But if the whole project's £7 million and you're retaining a million, I'm sure a contractor will want to complete that paperwork to get their money at the end of it. We talked about shared incentives. So that's like things like rewarding contractors for exceeding performance targets. So, you might have a performance target of 90 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum, and they come in at 65, and it's no more money. I don't know how they do that, but let's assume that it's possible. So yeah, it's really important that we think about different opportunities to drive performance and get the outcome that you need. So some best practice around contract management: you want to have regular reviews with your contractor. You want to see how they're progressing against the schedule, the project schedule. You want to understand any early warning issues around things like material issues. So, so when the war in Ukraine started, the cost of birch went through the roof because most of the birch comes from Siberia. So you can have these little things that are innocuous that happen in the world, and then suddenly it has an impact on a project that you're running. So it's really important that you keep a check on those sorts of things. You'll want to formalize change control procedure, particularly if there is something like a change in the works that you're doing or the houses that you're doing that impacts how it's going to play out with grant funding programs as well. You do need to document all your correspondence and your decisions. I really can't stress that more, and save them in a sensible folder somewhere where you can find them again in the future, just in case, because things do get missed. It's very difficult to keep track of things sometimes. So do your best to that. And then again, as we've sort of said previously, if you're setting up governance structures, you want to have a clear escalation pathway when things don't go the way you were hoping, or particular issues come up and you need additional support to resolve them. Okay, so we'll have a look at some setting expectations and avoiding common pitfalls. So looking at success criteria, what does success look like? We talk about this quite a lot sometimes, and it's always a bit nebulous, and success might be different things to different people. So it's really clear that we set what those success criteria are before we get going. And the diagram here shows a few that were probably important to every retrofit project. It's just, where do you put the value, and what's the final, everything else can kind of budge a little bit, but this one we can't budge on. So, you've got things like schedule constraints. Well, if you're in a government funded program, you do have constraints on what you can deliver in each year if you're a local grant, or within a phase, or the overall program timelines when they come to an end. You will have budget parameters. You've got some grant funding from the government, but you'll also have your own internal funding allocations. So you'll need to keep a track on those. And if there's, what's the contingency is there, and how do you manage that if the costs start to escalate? The whole program is set up around an energy performance target. So the ideal is that we get all of the homes to EPC. It's not always possible, but that's the aim for the program. You'll have those quality standards that you've put in place, and you want to make sure that your residents have those kind of comfort metrics that you might have put in place. So it might be something like the kilowatt hours of heat demand. It might be an amount of money they need to spend. It might be an equivalent metric where they feel like they can afford to pay for it and it's a warm home. So you need to be really clear at the outset what they are, and also you need to share it with your contractor so that they are aware what they're trying to achieve. So here we've got some common pitfalls, mitigation strategies. So just some examples. So a common pitfall is an unrealistic schedule, which is, and how you're going to see that is compressed critical paths and thinking about how quickly you can do work. So you really need to dive into that schedule if it's been produced by a contractor, and question it. How are you going to do that? Have you got 3 sets of teams working on this estate then? Because you've got all of this work happening at the same time. So I'm not sure how many people you've got working on it, and ask those questions and get an answer from it. Poor stakeholder engagement, sort of having those late stage objections, which can really slow up a project and make it very difficult. So, coming in early, doing some stakeholder mapping. Who are your key stakeholders? What do we know about them? Do we know if there are any objections? Have they been part of this program before? Did they object previously? What happened? Have they had works done previously that went wrong? What are the reasons why people might not want to be part of this program? And how can we go and have a conversation with them and provide some reassurance, or bring them into the conversation and understand what their concerns are, and seeing if we can get around those concerns and get them in the program and happy with what's going to happen. So I'm not going to go through all of these because there's quite a lot, but you'll get the slides and you can have a look later. We need to think about our communication framework. I talked earlier about regular meetings, and here's a sort of suggested approach. So you might want to have a strategic meeting monthly, sort of how we're going to kind of look at the longer term trajectory of this project. You might have a governance structure that meets quarterly and kind of does that strategic thing as well. You will definitely want a monthly report meeting to understand, exactly what's happening, when things are going to be starting, what the next phase is, how close you are to a milestone completion, when you're going to get that handover documentation, when the invoices are following, all of that sort of stuff. And then you've got those sort of daily operational meetings. Now, you as a project manager might not be at every single daily operational meeting. You might want to go along once a week. You might have other people going on different days, like a project officer or perhaps a tenant liaison officer. So it's certainly on site, those operational meetings need to happen so that people know what they're doing on what houses and where people got to previously. Okay, let's have a look at developing those strong relationships, because, when we can collaborate and get on with each other and form partnerships, life is much more enjoyable than having really transactional kind of contracts. And, we'll have all probably delivered on transactional contracts, and they can be really tricky. So you get into a point where you're really quickly focusing on the contract terms, and clause 2.4.3 says this and you haven't done it, and that's really painful and everybody hates that. And in that you've got this like win-lose. No one wins ultimately. It's a painful process, but somebody has to come out on top with a contract. You don't share knowledge and it gets retained, and it's because it becomes a really combative an environment. But if we start looking at, again, being collaborative, how can we work through this together? How do we make this a partnership approach? You can then start sharing things, information, metrics, performance. Often people go in as an open book and share that knowledge of where things are going and responsibility for resolving problems. It helps transfer knowledge. So, you can have contractors on site that have their specific knowledge of the issues that come up on site. By talking with people that maybe sat in the office that don't have that knowledge, they can learn, and vice versa. So it's really a very helpful way of kind of everybody having a better understanding of, my role is to do this. I don't understand your role, but it is my role to question what you're doing. And this is why I'm asking that question. It's not that I don't believe you're good enough. I just want to understand why you're doing it that way, or I need you to understand why I'm asking for this information, because this is the impact it has when it doesn't come through in time. So you start having those kind of more grown-up conversations, I'll call them, because I really do think it's about trying to be understanding that, we all do our jobs for a reason, mostly, and normally we have particular skills that make us good in that job, but we might not be good in another role. So understanding those differences can really help us work together better. And here we've got sort of some shared objectives. So thinking about the project objectives, thinking about how you can make that decision making as transparent as possible. Recognize our successes, whether they're mutual or individual, and then think about collaborating to come up with a better idea. And again, we've got something similar here. We've got a collaborative working method. So we might think about using digital collaboration platforms. There's a whole variety around there, but means we can all go into a project plan in real time, or we can go into shared folders and have a look for the information that we're looking for. It can reduce risks around GDPR for starters, and ensure that you can notify people that the folders have been updated and they can access the information they're looking for. And it can just be a bit of an easier process than going, okay, I'm now going to send you 57 emails with like lots of links on each of them. Let's think about how we can share our collective knowledge in design workshops. And that's not just design for the actual retrofit measures, but what are the processes that we need to do? How can we improve these processes? Again, if you're doing that lessons learned approach, you can bring that knowledge back into, okay, this isn't working. Why is it going wrong? How do we solve this? Because it's not normally just one organization's fault. There's normally a reason why the things are going wrong, and it's not always obvious. You might think, well, I'm sending the information, and I do it every Thursday, and I know I do it, and I don't understand why it's not actioned. And then you find out that, I don't know, it's going to the wrong person, or it's not in a format they can action, or that person can't get to their computer for another 3 days. I don't know. I'm just making those things up, but we need to kind of think about those things, and that can help us to share that knowledge and manage that in that process, and think about opportunities, how we can work together to make it better. When we think about contractor performance management, we want to be really clear what the contractor's performance are by providing KPIs, key performance indicators, and they need to be measurable at some level, and they need to be achievable. You might want to put a stretch target in, but you need to be able to achieve the target that's been put in place as a basic. You need to have those regular performance reviews, so the monthly meetings can be that, the quarterly meetings, but if you're going to have KPIs, you've got to go over KPIs, you've got to understand how people are performing against them. It needs to be a two-way conversation about providing that constructive feedback, and working together to come up with a solution, and having that continuous improvement focus. So it kind of aligns with all the other things we've set out at the beginning stage, really. And so, we build trust by being as transparent as we can, by being honest, by delivering against what we say we're going to do. I think that's a really important one. If we say we're going to get that to you by Tuesday, let's get it to you by Tuesday. Getting it to you by next Friday is not really building a trust here, is it? I can't get it by Tuesday, but I'm going to phone you on Tuesday and say, I'm really sorry, it's now going to be Friday, and this is the reason why. Encourage communication, be as open as you can, provide feedback, think about where things can be improved. Recognize good performance, and reward it where it's appropriate if you can. And then find a way to resolve conflicts as amicably as possible. There's no benefit to anyone when it gets to a grumpy kind of, or a shouting match, and then you go, oh, let's bring the lawyers in. That's the only one that benefits there are the lawyers. So, we need to find a solution to make sure that we can move forward in contracts, and try not to do that. So, thinking about what are the best partnerships when conflicts do arise, how do we need to get out of them? How do we identify those issues early and try and resolve them, maybe through escalation routes, so that we're not into that painful, difficult conversation. We need to stick to facts. We're all very good at getting very emotional about things when things don't go our way. So we really need to remove the emotion and go back to the clear facts of the issue, and then try and look at it afresh and go, okay, what we could have done here is this, and that would have solved that problem. And it's not always easy to see in the heat of the moment, but we need to try and move back. We need to keep a focus on those overarching project objectives and how we can get back to that, rather than necessarily getting stuck in the detail, which is where we end up having those issues. And we've got here detailed resolution process to ensure clarity for everybody about what's going to happen. Now, sometimes that's written out in your contract terms. We'll use this mediation organization or this contract thing. You could also put it in a governance document, particularly if you're having regular governance meetings in a partnership environment with a contractor, and that can be picked up as one of those things moving forward. Okay, so I'm coming towards the end. Kind of key summary points. It's worth investing time at the front end to really think about your delivery plan, everything that entails, and writing it down so that you've got a reference point, and sharing with your contractor the key elements it's important that they know about. There's no point you having this lovely plan and no one in your team knows about it, and your contractor doesn't know about it. So you need to share the relevant points as well. Ideally, let's focus on building collaborative partnerships that focus on the outcomes and not getting fixated with other elements of it. We need to be clear about our expectations. We need to set measurable criteria, and they need to be monitored to see whether they're being achieved. You need to implement those robust project controls, so gateway procedures, change control procedures, escalation points, all of those sorts of things. And also, let's think about, what do you want from the project? Is the lowest price going to get you the best outcome? Or am I going to have to think about, no, the best outcome that I get here is the performance not the price. So actually, I'm going to change the route that I'm going to kind of procure at. And that is the end of the session. As you know, we've got our on-demand resources, and that's the end of the session.